Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to everybody that was here from early morning or afternoon, I would say, from the opening ceremony, and also was here for the first keynote to speak. I really hope that you enjoyed the opening ceremony and the first keynote talk. And also welcome to everybody that is joining now for the keynote, the second keynote talk that we start right now. I really hope that you enjoy the conference and you find the conference motivating and enjoyable. I would like to introduce our second keynote talk today. My colleague, Professor Graham Town from Macquarie University. He's a professor with 30 years of experience in engineering education and research, and also 8 years of experience in the Australian electronics industry. He received his bachelor's with first honors degree from University of Technology, Sydney in 1989, and a PhD in medical imaging from University of Sydney in 1992, and a graduate certificate in leadership and management, higher education from Macquarie University in 2007. He's currently an honorary professor in the Department of Engineering at Macquarie University, where he established the university's undergraduate engineering program, first offered in 2004. He has published extensively in diverse areas, including optical fiber communication and sensing technology and systems, engineering education, and recent years he has been leading industry-supported research projects on power electronics for compact and efficient power conversion, smart grids with focus on electric vehicle integration management. I would like to invite him to give us a talk about electric vehicles in the grid, challenges and opportunities for sustainable energy and transport. Professor Graham Town.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. I trust everyone can hear me and see me okay. And I'd like to start by thanking Professor Wen and Associate Professor Shania for the invitation to give this keynote. It's certainly an honour to be here amongst such distinguished company. I'd also like to compliment them on putting together a very good conference under difficult circumstances. And difficulties are often a challenge, but they can provide the impetus to do things differently and hopefully better, which coincidentally is largely what this presentation is mostly about. I'll start by sharing, see if we can share the screen and get going. Okay, another participant is sharing.
Oh, apologies, that was me, sorry.
No problem. Okay, we're good now.
For us, yeah, to have you here. Sorry, I stopped that. Thank you.
There we go. How's that? Okay. So a lot of the insights that I'll be sharing in this presentation came from conducting an ARC linkage project, which is an industry collaborative project on distributed energy storage and management, the focus of which was actually electric vehicles. During the course of this project, which finished at the end of last year, over 5 million vehicles came onto the world's roads, fully electric vehicles came onto the world's roads. And during that time, there were also quite a lot of changes. This project encompassed two sides of the electric vehicle. One is the communication for monitoring and management, and then the other side was the grid interface. So the idea was to collect information from the vehicles and use that information to manage their impact on the grid. The communication side evolved from 2G, and now we're up to 3G, 4G, 5G, even Internet of Things. On the other hand, the grid hasn't evolved so quickly, but I think it's about to start doing that. So let's start and look at a couple of headlines from just this year that have been appearing in different news feeds. Volkswagen plans to tap electric car batteries to compete with power firms. We've got a car manufacturer planning to compete with electricity companies. A Scandinavian telecom provider is going to offer electric vehicle charging solutions. And then Tritium, which is a power electronics company that builds chargers, has produced a charger which can turn electric vehicles effectively into phones or credit cards on wheels. What's going on here? Everything is changing substantially from what those of us who are familiar with the past electricity industry and the way it worked. Where are we going? Almost anything's possible in this new world. It's a very large and complex area, and some of these developments are very difficult to make sense of without a larger overarching framework, which is what I'm going to start by providing and sharing with you before moving on to more detailed stuff. So if we look at where is transport technology going, will it be this, which looks green and hopefully in future will be green, the people's car, or this, which doesn't really look green but is just as green as the one above, or the autonomous vehicle down here, which is for transporting people around, a new mode of transport effectively. Well, in future, we'll have all of these things, I think, in the transport mix. And one thing's certain is that they'll all be electric. And when we consider electric vehicles, there's a range of electric vehicles as well, from fuel cell electric vehicles through to hybrids and so on. The things I'll be discussing in this presentation are really around battery-powered electric vehicles, fully battery electric vehicles, although all the others which have electric drivetrains, in some way, there will be some relevance to those as well. We look at what's happening with the electricity grid. We'd all be familiar with this idea of development from centralized generation and a one-way distribution of electricity to the future where we'll have distributed generation and distributed storage to compensate for variability in the increasingly renewable generation. Along with that comes more communication between all the different elements in the system that's needed to manage that. That storage could be provided by electric vehicles, in fact, but there's some challenges. First of all, they move. So there's not only a temporal variability in their availability, there is a spatial variability as well. Also, we need to consider that there's potential competition between energy and transport services. To some extent, transport depends on energy, but can also contribute to the operation of the energy system. There's also potential competition between the owners of vehicles and the infrastructure. So who owns things and who gets to use them and who benefits in the long run? These are all questions that are quite important to answer. And if we look at the future of combined transport and energy systems, there's a number of business models that we could imagine, and probably others that are yet to emerge. The first one is basically business as usual. So this is sort of the Tesla model, where a consumer purchases a vehicle, owns a vehicle, and also purchases the energy to drive that vehicle around, just like we do now, except using electricity instead of carbon-based fuels. Under this model, if these vehicles are used the way that commuters currently use vehicles, those vehicles are parked for 95% of the time, which means that they have a relatively low utilization for transport. And for the energy industry, the good side is that there is a high availability for providing energy services and participating in the grid. At the opposite extreme, we've got transport as a service, where no one owns a vehicle, and you just dial up a taxi whenever you need to go somewhere. Under this situation, the vehicles will be utilized highly for transport, which means they're going to be a very small availability for participating in energy services, but that doesn't necessarily reduce the impact that they have on the energy system. They'll be wanting to charge very fast, and that can have a significant impact when they do connect to the energy system. In between, there's a couple of other models. The own the vehicle and subscribe to an energy provider is one way of doing things. It's a bit like what we do with mobile phones at the moment, where you own a mobile phone and subscribe to access the telecommunication network. The other one is more interesting, where you own the vehicle and you use that vehicle to play in an energy market. So you behave as a prosumer using this significant asset, which is basically a large battery on wheels, to participate in the energy market through vehicle to grid or vehicle to X. And in that case, the owner of the vehicle is responsible for balancing their own utilisation with the needs, their own needs and the needs of others. And we could also bring into this the possibility of autonomous vehicles, which have been undergoing trials now for some years. So under this transport as a subscription service, you don't even need drivers in the foreseeable future. One thing that is certain is that electric vehicles will be a multifunctional platform. When you think about it, if you combine communication technology with energy, you get what people sometimes call a smart grid, potentially a smart grid. If you combine communication technology with transport, you get something that people usually refer to as intelligent transport, and that includes autonomous vehicles. There is a very strong link between transport and energy. Currently, about 30% of energy that we consume in the developed world is for transport, and it's largely carbon-based at the moment as well. So by coupling transport and energy, particularly if it's electric energy, then we can have a sustainable energy and transport system. And electric vehicles sit in the middle of this. So they are part of all of these three different subsystems. They utilize those three different subsystems, but they can also contribute to each of those three different subsystems. So electric vehicles are a very interesting platform. As I mentioned before, they will provide multiple services. So they will be communication hubs. And in the communication world, people refer to vehicle to X, that is the vehicle communicating to anything else, stationary or other moving objects. In the energy world, we refer to vehicle to X as transferring energy from the vehicle to and from other things. And then, of course, there's the transport use, which may or may not become less important, given that we all seem to be communicating more from our homes and telecommuting rather than physically commuting. Now, it's worth recognising that all of these things operate within an economic and legal system. And so we need to think about that as well. And this slide's meant to indicate that. So here's the technology. That's relatively easy when you consider that what's holding up the use of this technology is often to do with either legal concerns or social issues. People don't like new technologies, or perhaps even difficulties getting finance and building a business case for these things. All of these sectors interact at a higher level, and the amount of interaction depends on a number of things, their characteristics, but also their own dynamics. They all have their own timescales. Fortunately, the timescales are all quite different. Otherwise, we would get strong coupling between them, and the whole system could become unstable, in fact. But one thing that is worth considering is, can commodity markets such as electricity be used to regulate complex technical systems such as electrified transport systems and energy systems? That's currently what we're trying to do with the electricity system at the moment. There's a market which is trying to regulate supply and demand, instantaneous supply and demand of power. In future, I'm hoping that things will change, but this is something I'll touch on again a little bit later. So now let's get on to the main part of the talk. There's quite a lot to get through, so I won't spend too much time on this particular slide. But I will say that over the last few years that I've been working in this space, the focus has changed from potential problems posed by electric vehicles, questions such as will the grid cope, to now very much thinking about how we can utilise electric vehicles to advantage in assisting the grid, particularly with increasing amounts of renewable energy coming into the grid. Okay, so what's driving the uptake of electric vehicles in various parts of the world? Well, there are some clear advantages. They're much more efficient. They're 4 or 5 times more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. And we've calculated that even if they were charged from coal-fired power stations, there would still be about a 20% reduction in carbon emissions if everyone was driving electric vehicles. There's clearly health benefits from reducing carbon emissions and environmental benefits. One that people don't often notice is fuel security, but countries have gone to war over access to oil and energy. So this is quite an important one from a global perspective as well. Now, all of these advantages often drive government policy, and they're driving it in different places by different amounts in different parts of the world. If we look at the growth rate of electric vehicles, it's going up very rapidly. Up until this year, the growth rate in China, at least, was about 80%, similarly in parts of the USA, and 35% in Europe. Not so large in Australia, where we're a late starter in this, but it's picking up. Over 50% of vehicles sold each year in Norway are fully electric already, and I'll go into reasons for that later on. Over 50% of all electric vehicles sold globally are in China. And although we're just over 5 million fully electric vehicles currently, they're expecting 125 million vehicles, fully electric vehicles, to be on the road by 2030. So whether or not it's coincidence, I've linked the growth rate of electric vehicles and the phasing out of electric vehicles by different government policies to the targets for reduction of carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 on the right-hand side. Norway's at the top of the list. They're going to phase out all internal combustion engine vehicles by 2025, and they have quite an aggressive carbon reduction target as well. You can see going down the list that there are various other targets for both phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles and phasing out carbon emissions. I'll skip this slide for the moment. One of the things that's been holding up the uptake of electric vehicles is the cost. However, as the cost of batteries reduces, the cost of the vehicles is of course going to reduce as well, and this should help with uptake in future. Another thing that's been holding up the uptake of electric vehicles has been the range. However, from 2020, all electric vehicles coming onto the market will have over 200 kilometres range, at least all commuter vehicles. So that's no longer really an issue either. Most people, particularly when they're using vehicles for commuting, only drive 50 kilometres a day at most. The third thing is access to charging infrastructure. If we ignore for the moment the fact that anyone can charge at home by plugging into a power point overnight, then the only other thing is access to fast charging. And here in most parts of the world, the growth in fast charging facilities has outstripped the growth in vehicles themselves. So actually access to charging is not really an issue as well. So there's no problems with electric vehicles. We can forget about all the excuses that people have been giving in the past. This is a slightly revised update for growth in electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles from Bloomberg and New Energy Finance. This blip here is due to COVID, so it's not much more than a blip. The sales of internal combustion engine vehicles have been dropping for some years now, as you can see over on the right here. The growth of electric vehicles is continuing, and around 2025, it's expected that your new electric vehicle will cost about the same as an internal combustion engine vehicle. Given that they're much cheaper to drive, there's much lower maintenance, it's expected that after about 2025, everyone will want an electric vehicle. So the impacts are going to start to grow very rapidly from within the next few years. How does that, what does that mean for charging infrastructure? Well, as the batteries in the vehicles get larger and their range gets larger, we will need higher power DC chargers, at least for fast charging, where people want to charge within half an hour. Interestingly, currently, most people charge at home, except in Norway, and I'll come back to that one shortly, but 80% of charging is done at home. So what's the fuss around fast charging? I'll come back to that a bit later on as well. And let's not forget heavy electric vehicles. So most people think about light vehicles because that's what they drive, but the targets for phasing out heavy electric vehicles are more aggressive than even for the light electric vehicles. Most countries will be phasing out internal combustion engine and diesel driven buses at least 5 years before their targets for phasing out light vehicles. And there's an example here of a light vehicle, a heavy vehicle, a bus from Denmark. There's some interesting questions around how these systems should be designed. For example, should they have large batteries and charge only at the depot, or should they have small batteries and charge en route? I'm not going to have time to go into those questions here. But again, the payback period for these electric buses is not that different from light vehicles. Within several years, the savings in maintenance and energy pay for these vehicles. It's possible to make buses that will drive 1,000 kilometres on a single charge, and this is an example of a bus that was being developed in Melbourne to drive from Melbourne to Sydney on a single charge. The USA is looking to convert all of its heavy vehicle transport to electric by 2040. And in Australia, we have a company called Sea Electric, which has been converting heavy electric vehicles from internal combustion engine drive to electric drive. So this is for rubbish collection trucks and other similar applications. And the uptake of those vehicles is extraordinarily rapid. Now, we've also got to consider aircraft. And if you thought self-driving vehicles was pie in the sky, then it's time that you saw this video. I've shown it before, and it's a couple of years old, I'm afraid, but let's have a quick look. So in the interest of time, I'll stop that there. This particular aircraft is for one person. It goes about 20 kilometres in 20 minutes and then needs to be recharged. But if battery technology improves, as some people suggest, with energy density increasing by 1 or more orders of magnitude, then that will improve the range of these vehicles as well. This particular vehicle is not self-driving. However, for safety reasons, most of these aircraft, I think, will be self-driving in future. One thing to consider is that we will probably need to think about how to put high power chargers on rooftops. So that's one to go away and have some thoughts about. Now then, oops, sorry, we stopped that one. Spain has recently announced that it will be starting an air taxi service in its Catalan capital. So this is an electric air taxi service there. And oops, sorry, we've gone back again. And there is a company in Spain, I believe, that, and that's shown down on the right hand here, which has an autonomous pod for transporting, I think, up to a couple of passengers around. So these things are surprisingly close, and also will have an impact on the electricity grid. Other developments, there's a number I need to get through quickly. Fast charging infrastructure. An Australian company, Tritium, has a scalable fast charging product which allows whole car parks to be full of relatively high power chargers, and they're concentrating on the high power charging market as well. Other companies such as ABB have a whole suite of charging solutions available today. Everything from buses, whether at the depot or on the move, to autonomous vehicles in ports, to home residential charging. And they also have an 11 kilowatt bidirectional charger for vehicle to grid available as well, I believe. When we think about charging, we also need to think about charging standards. And this is where there has been another minor impediment to the progress in electric vehicle to grid integration. Basically, when we think about charging, we think about power and direction. How much power can the charger provide, and can that go in one or both directions? Up until very recently, you could get one or the other, but not both. However, quite recently, this year, in fact, CHAdeMO announced a third version of their standard, which is both high power and bidirectional. CHAdeMO is the only standard which currently is for bidirectional transfer of energy, and it's been used in a lot of the vehicle to grid trials around the world that I'll be discussing later on. The CCS standard is a higher power standard, but it's currently only unidirectional. We're expecting that a bidirectional standard will become available in a year or two. It'll be interesting to see how that competes with the CHAdeMO standard. In all of this, this is just the plug. Of course, behind the plug there is signaling and functionality, and there's various standards around those things, which I won't have time to go into here, except to say that the standards are developing very much along the lines of how telecommunication system standards evolved, with a layered OSI stack. And there's a number of parallels with the development of telecommunication systems that can be applied in the area of electric vehicles and grid integration, and I'll come back to that as well, again, a little bit later on. One particular thing that needs to be considered with telecommunications is what telecommunications are required to communicate with large fleets of electric vehicles, whether they're autonomous or not. And one thing that we showed a few years ago was that the current 4G wireless system runs out of steam very quickly. And this is motivating, or one of the motivations and one of the reasons for rolling out of 5G and even 6G wireless telecommunication systems. Of course, to communicate with a mobile vehicle, you can only do that using wireless communications, at least when it's mobile and not plugged in. So 5G and ultimately 6G wireless communications will bring new advantages, one of the major ones being scalability to transport, but also there'll be a reduction in latency and an increase in reliability, which has important implications for smart grid applications as well, which we expect that electric vehicles will be a part of. So now let's look at some of the other issues around electric vehicles and grid integration. At Macquarie University, we've been asking the question, what if all vehicles were electric? What if all cars were electric? What would the impacts be? How could we manage those impacts most effectively? And the solution to this is partly to consider electric vehicles simply as batteries on wheels or mobile storage. When you consider the potential impacts, it's not hard to do some back of the envelope calculations around the increase in demand from electric vehicles. We'd expect it's going to be 15% or so. Others will say an increase in 15% in average demand. Others suggest it may be a bit more, others a bit less. And the amount of storage available is actually quite large compared to the amount of storage that's currently going into domestic installations. One thing that we can say for sure is that in the future, there will be much more storage on wheels, mobile storage in electric vehicles, than there is likely to be in households. That could change in the longer term, but in the shorter term, I think that's very much going to be the case. It bears looking at parallels with between different scales of installation, because the vehicles and the scales are going to be quite diverse. On the left-hand side, we've got a typical solar farm with battery storage, and on the right-hand side, a home with an electric vehicle which has a battery in it. If we look at the scale of the solar panels on a typical roof, you'll get a certain amount. In a solar farm, you'll get 20,000 times more power generating capacity. If we look at the battery in the electric vehicle, there's only 1,000 times difference. So potentially you could do a lot more with the battery in someone's home than you could do with the battery in a solar farm. And we already know from demonstrations, at least in South Australia, with the famous Tesla battery, that storage close to solar and wind farms, so battery storage close to solar and wind farms, is having a huge impact and a very great value. So imagine what would happen if we could scale it up into people's homes. There's a few ways in which we can imagine that electric vehicles will impact the grid positively and or negatively. The first one would be if we have unscheduled charging, then there's likely to be an increase in the peak load in the early evenings when people get home from work, assuming that everyone is driving vehicles as commuters. This has two problems, not only the peak load, but the extremely fast ramp rate here, which current coal-fired generators can't keep up with, and is one of the motivations for increasing gas generation. The second thing would be if you could schedule the charging and spread the charging out over the evening, then it will certainly reduce the peak. But it will not have an impact on during the day, where if you could plug the vehicle in during the day at work, you could take the back out of the duct. That is, if all of the generation that is occurring from renewable sources during the day could be absorbed by those electric vehicles and taken home and even used in the homes when they get home. And in principle, if everything is really well managed, you could have 100% utilisation of the electricity grid in partnership with electric vehicles taking energy around. I'll move on now. The electric vehicles can have an impact on an individual home, but by aggregating the vehicles, one can imagine that you would increase the usefulness to the grid and the wider society. And we're already seeing applications of storage aggregation in virtual power plants and the value of that. There have been a number of companies in Australia, at least, and overseas that have been pioneers in aggregating stationary storage systems and providing services to the grid with payments back to the owners of the storage as benefits. Imagine what you could do if you could do the same thing with electric vehicles. Now, when we're talking about electric vehicles, they're essentially, as I said, batteries on wheels. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of storage in the grid? Well, when you look at the applications of storage, there is one application where everyone wins, and that's in e-mobility and ancillary services and renewable generation stabilisation. So when you pair electric mobility with renewable generation stabilisation, everyone is a winner. And there is a natural synergy, I believe, between electric vehicles and our ability to increase the amount of renewable generation in our grid, and therefore the sustainability of our grid, at the same time as improving the sustainability of our transport systems. Now, I'd next like to look at a couple of examples of trials mainly from overseas, and showing what those impacts that are likely to be of electric vehicles on the grid and how they can be managed and the advantages of managing them. So there are a number of levels of grid integration that have been defined, going from simply grid compliant charging through to aggregated vehicle to grid systems. For level 2 and below, basically one is looking at minimizing the negative impacts of electric vehicle charging on the grid, whereas once you get to bidirectional systems, you can start to think about maximizing the positive impacts. So going to no grid connection, that's our ground zero, so to speak. There's no connection to the grid. You can still have charging systems. For example, here is a standalone solar charging system coupled to a battery. It collects energy during the day into the battery, and then you can dump that energy into the vehicle. No impact on the grid, but on the other hand, this doesn't bring any benefits to the grid either. And you can scale it up, of course, and even add some grid connection in to try and improve or bring some benefits to the grid. One of the issues with uncontrolled charging is that it's for some time been recognised that the impacts on the grid are not just to do with peak load, that is the timing of the impacts, but also the location of the impacts. Because the vehicles move around, it matters when and where they charge as to what those impacts will be. So this adds a dimension of complexity to the whole problem, which from an academic perspective is actually quite interesting to deal with. But we know, for example, and I've already shown that by charge scheduling, you can reduce the peak in time, but you may still get concentrations of electric vehicles in space. You know, some suburbs will be able to afford electric vehicles more than others, so you get more electric vehicles in those regions, and the grid impact is likely to be higher, even with controlled charging in time. So we need to think about strategies for managing the load on the grid in time and space. There have been some simulations done on the likely impact of electric vehicle charging in time and also space. This particular paper deals mainly with the impacts in time. And as I mentioned before, the average load is likely to increase by maybe 15%. This one suggests 6% increase in average load factor. This is often within the range that the current grid is designed to cope with. What is new here is with fast charging, the change in the peakiness of that load. And so this particular paper, it's a simulation, showed that with a 60% increase in average load factor, you'll get a 100% or more increase in the peak load. And that does present potential problems. This is an experimental study that was done with about 100 vehicles in the USA a couple of years ago. And interestingly, it showed that most charging was done at home using level 2 chargers. DC fast charging accounted only for 2.5% of the consumption, but it accounted for most of the peaks in this load profile. So fast charging has a disproportionately large impact on the peak load seen by the grid. And that's something that we need to think about how to manage. Moreover, the peak load will increase with the size of the battery in the vehicle. So as I mentioned before, the batteries in vehicles are getting larger. These peak load issues are largely to increase over time. You can see that in this example here. In the latter half of this trial, a number of Teslas entered the study. They weren't there in the beginning, and you can see the impact on the peakiness of the load profile there. So average load's not likely to be an issue, but peak load is. One thing that may help with peak load, which we can learn from the impact of photovoltaic generation on the grid, is that diversity helps. So diversity in the case of photovoltaics is geographical, but also with electric vehicles, you get diversity in use patterns. Both of these, on average, will smooth out the demand profile. There will still be local problems to deal with, and that's again where we need to think about ways to deal with those locally. But from a global perspective, geographical diversity and diversity in use patterns should help to some extent. The question is how much, and I think some of these things are areas for ongoing research. A large study in the UK that completed recently called Electric Nation basically came to the same conclusion that I've already hinted at, is that with controlled charging, there is no need to upgrade the existing grid capacity. You can avoid those peak issues with controlled charging. How do you control the peaks? Well, there's a number of different ways. Indirect what I would call indirect charge control is through price signals. So by increasing the price at peak times, you can try and reduce the demand. This doesn't always have a very desirable impact on the demand. You can see here, again, as soon as the rates drop for charging, you can potentially get a very large increase in demand all of a sudden. Better than indirect charge control is direct charge control or demand management, where again you spread the demand out and that's controlled either centrally or from, well, it can be done in a number of ways. I won't go into the details here, but this is the sort of thing that might be managed by your energy retailer. Coming to bidirectional charging. Bidirectional charging first came to the fore as a result of the tsunami and that occurred in Fukushima and the damage caused there. At that point in time, there were only small electric vehicles, Mitsubishi i-MiEVs, that had a 16 kilowatt hour battery. But already in Japan, they had come up with this thing called a power box, which they could take the energy from the vehicle and use it to power critical services in their homes. So refrigeration and lighting, those sorts of things. These days, we're getting much more sophisticated about this, and the uses of these type of the energy stored in your vehicle for powering your home and so on, it's becoming, the possibilities are becoming much greater. In fact, you know, again, the Japanese are ahead, I think, on this with respect to behind the meter energy management, where you have solar panels, electric vehicles, and various other energy efficiency technologies, including solid state lighting. Now, if you aggregated these, you could also provide services back to the grid. I'm going to skip, oops, I'm going to skip this slide, I'm sorry. And we'll talk about aggregated level 4 charging, that is bidirectional charging. And this brings me to some of the things that we've been doing at Macquarie University, where we've been looking at various use cases, for example, parking lots, commuting, and also service fleet applications of grid integration of vehicles. A recent result, still unpublished, concerns how would you manage energy in an apartment block. So this is a parking station in a particular location, an apartment block where people live. And the question is it better for individuals to manage their electric vehicle charging and their home energy usage and some solar generation from the rooftop individually, or is it better to manage that as a group for the apartment block? And probably it's not surprising, there is some advantage to aggregated management or collaborative management of energy for the whole apartment block. This advantage in this particular study was calculated as a cost, but you could also think about other benefits such as grid impact, peak load, those sorts of things. Another parking lot that we looked at was a nearby Macquarie shopping centre, which has about 4,500 electric vehicle parking, or 4,500 parking spaces. If all of those parking spaces were filled by electric vehicles, that is equivalent to 180 megawatt hours of peak storage, larger than, again, the Tesla battery that was installed in South Australia to support a large solar farm down there and their energy system generally. That is a huge resource. Of course, you need to install charging points and connect all those vehicles together and into the grid. But if you could, that is a resource that is located in the middle of the city, not tens or hundreds of kilometres away near the closest renewable solar or wind farms. One of the interesting things about the occupancy of the parking lots is they follow a Weibull distribution, and it's not that different from the irradiance that you expect to be receiving. So if those car parks were covered with solar panels, you could, there's a natural match between the number of vehicles in the car park and the amount of power being generated from the solar panels. And you wouldn't need a very large battery to shift the difference from the morning to the early evening. Another study we did was using transport data. So this is transport data on light vehicles, current internal combustion engine vehicles for the state of New South Wales, and asking the question, well, if all of these vehicles were fully electric, how many of them could complete their travel during the day, and what would be the excess energy in those vehicles that could be available to provide services to the grid or vehicle-to-vehicle transfers and those sorts of things. First of all, we found that 88% of trips in the Greater Sydney area were serviceable by a fully battery-powered electric vehicle, and the example used was the Nissan Leaf in this case. This is very similar number to what came up with a similar study in the USA. The other more interesting thing from my perspective is that if you look at the plot of energy availability, and this is time on the horizontal, it's not distance on the vertical, but it's related to location. Wherever you are, at whatever time you are there is always 3 to 5 times more energy stored in those vehicles than is needed by the vehicles to complete their journeys for the day. So that's again a huge resource that could be useful for providing service to the grid or transferring energy from one vehicle to another and assisting others in their transport. A project I was fortunate to become involved in Denmark was the first commercial vehicle-to-grid project or trial, which occurred in Copenhagen. It was basically 10 Nissan vehicles with 10 kilowatt bidirectional chargers were connected up. These were fleet vehicles, so the usage was relatively regular. They were parked overnight and they went out and came back at relatively regular times during the day. And the purpose of this study was to investigate, the variability and availability of the batteries and the value of the accessing those batteries for supporting the grid. In this case, they were providing frequency control ancillary services. So that was the market that they were participating in. Each vehicle had a different leaving time, return time, and energy usage per trip. But nevertheless, it was interesting to compare different vehicles and their availability and calculate the value of whatever availability they had and optimize their participation in the local grid. And the Danish group calculated that the value was about €120 per month per vehicle for having the batteries participating in the grid. One other project that was at DTU, Danish Technical University, was the ACES project, and they looked at a common question comes up, well, what's the cost of degradation of the batteries through using them in vehicle-to-grid trials? And this is something that they particularly looked at and I participated in. And they basically showed that the degradation in vehicles is quite small. And in fact, it's comparable to the annual degradation that occurs just through calendar aging. I've also seen some studies which hint at the fact that in some cases, you can extend the life of the battery by cycling them more and having them participate in vehicle-to-grid activities. Okay, I'm going to move fairly fast now through the rest of this. There's a slide here which gives a reference to over 50 vehicle-to-grid projects and the associated learnings that have been done over the last few years around the world. And here's a couple of specifically quite interesting projects, one around heavy vehicles, another one around commuter fleets. And in Australia, there's a couple of vehicle-to-grid projects just started up this year, one funded by the ACT government and ARENA, looking at fleet vehicles, and another one for domestic installations. Both of those involve AGL. The value of vehicle-to-grid appears to be improving, so let me just leave it at that. And with this one, these are all the services that you could provide with a grid-connected electric vehicle. I'm not going to go through the details, but in addition to global search services such as frequency control, it's very easy to imagine that you could provide local voltage support services, reactive power services, and generally improve the operation of the grid in a number of ways if you have a large battery connected to the grid. So lastly, I just want to finish with some crystal ball gazing and be a little bit provocative. So first of all, I want to start by considering what would happen if we had a smart grid where you had a lot of autonomous agents trading energy based on its cost. Well, I would be concerned about that based on what we've seen in the stock market. I don't know how many of you have heard of flash crashes, but basically this is where computer automated trading is causing some problems. The computers buy and sell stocks based on price, and if they all buy and sell at the same time because they see the stock at the price that triggers their buying or selling, then they can trigger what's called a flash crash, where the value of the stock market drops by about 10% within seconds. Now, this is only dollars and cents, and it's all stored in a computer somewhere. The market comes back over a period of minutes. However, if this occurred in a technical system, a cyber physical system, such as our previous keynote speaker referred to, then it could bring the system down completely. Interestingly, the communication that's going on between all the automated trading centers in such a network is very different when things are operating normally to during the period of the flash crash. And this gives some indication, again, harking back to the previous keynote presentation, that the structure of the network matters and the amount of communication that is allowed matters. And this is spawning some research looking at different network structures and how that might have an impact on grid stability. Also, it's the delays in communication around these networks, of course, are critically important as well. But I think that we could avoid all of those issues if we didn't worry about trading second by second with energy, but just said, okay, let all electricity be free. When you think about it, the variable cost of generating renewable energy is zero. Once you've installed the solar panels, once you've installed the wind generators, the cost of doubling the amount of energy produced does not double, unlike in a coal-fired power station where you have to put twice as much coal in. So why couldn't electricity be free? That is, not a commodity. You'd have to pay for access to such a system, and the amount that you would pay would depend on the power that you required, the instantaneous rate of energy that you needed, not on the amount of energy that you needed. This could then flow on to things such as free electric vehicle charging, which has already been demonstrated in Norway using their substantial hydroelectricity resources. And this was one of the factors behind the very rapid uptake of electric vehicles in Norway. Unfortunately, they've since phased out the free charging because they found that everyone was going to the free fast charging, and there were queues for the fast chargers. So they are now currently charging for the access to the public charging stations. In Australia, we're seeing similar things happening with free charging being installed in shopping centres. This is an attraction to people who own electric vehicles to go to those shopping centres and park there whilst they go shopping. It's unlikely that they'll put fast charging into these sort of situations because they want you to stay in the shopping centre longer and spend more money. There is a definite value in having people in the shopping centres longer. But this is all happening now, quite doable. One other thing I'd like to finish with is this idea of an internet of energy. When people think about an internet of energy, they think, oh, that's just the energy system, but with the internet, communicating, monitoring, maybe controlling the grid. I actually refer to an internet of energy as more than that. I think it's more than a smart grid enabled by information and communication technology. It's an energy network which operates like the internet, but for energy instead of information. So the top is the internet. The top figure here is the internet, and the bottom figure here would be the equivalent in energy. You have sources and sinks of energy. These can move around. Certainly that's the case with electric vehicles. So you can move energy around as well as load and supply around physically within the network. You've also got wires which can transfer energy, but I'd suggest that it makes things a bit easier if you transfer energy in packets through such a system. These types of systems would probably share features with telecommunication systems. They'd be hierarchical. They'd have local, metropolitan and wide area dimensions. They should be, importantly, they should be plug and play. That is, it should be possible to take your electric vehicle and plug it anywhere in the network and either provide energy to the network or take energy from the network without having a complicated system for recognizing the vehicle and recognizing the value of the energy that's provided or taken from the network. This is clearly possible with today's power electronics combined with information and communication technology. And I'd suggest that if we approach the design of energy systems in this way, it will open up that idea of free energy, free electricity, make that more practical. Just as we have free bits these days, the cost of information is so low, it's essentially free. We could have free energy after you've paid the access fee. And along those lines, again, this company, Tritium, an Australian company, has, I mentioned, come up with a charger where your vehicle can go up and plug into any charger and the bill goes back to you or the owner of the vehicle. You don't need a card and complicated swipe access systems to charge up. So that's just the beginning of this Internet of Energy idea coming to be realised. So in conclusion, electric vehicles are on the way and they're accelerating. They're going to be multifunctional platforms. They'll have the ability to provide services in communications, transport and energy, and therefore have an impact on those systems as well. There's much work still to be done on understanding and particularly in predicting the impacts of electric vehicles on the grid, but in general, I think the message is that it's manageable. However, the peakiness of fast charging is going to require either more investment into the network or more investment into management technology in order to ensure that the peakiness of fast charging doesn't detriment the grid and its operation. So there's clearly some opportunities here for electric vehicles to make positive impacts, technical, environmental, economic. The question is, how do we align all of the regulatory, market and technical aspects so that we get a rapid move towards accessing these benefits through transport electrification. I believe that transport electrification was a priority after the 2008 global financial crisis in Europe, and that's one of the reasons why Europe is well ahead in this area. I'm hoping that governments will see the pandemic caused by COVID-19 as a similar opportunity for recovery by shifting the way that we're doing things. So I'll just finish with this particular slide here. It's a summary of the challenges and opportunities. The change is always an opportunity to improve. Hopefully we won't do things less well. The question is, how do we get to where we want to go from where? And it's a multi-dimensional, multi-scale system. That makes it complicated, but it also makes it interesting. There's a potential to provide clean and cheap energy and transport services by coupling the energy and transport systems through transport electrification. We need to do some more thinking about market design. I've proposed a potential solution there. And then if we do it well, we should improve the resilience and the reliability as well as the sustainability of our transport and energy systems, tying in developments in information and communication technology. Of course, there's also some issues around security and dealing with the large temporal and spatial dimensions, but in principle, I don't see these as insurmountable. So I'll finish the presentation there, and thanks for your attention. I'll go back to accept questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. It's really interesting. Now the panel is open for ask. Yes. Which one?
Sorry, apologies, Sarah. It seems your voice is just breaking down a bit. But thank you very much, Professor Tan, for the very interesting and informative talk discussing all different aspects. So the microphones have been allowed for the people to unmute themselves and ask questions, as well as you can use the chat box as well. Please go ahead.
Is this better now, or?
Yes, much better. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a question. I don't know. There is a question from Fushuan in the chat room. Very interesting presentation from Rich Information. Do you know, are there any practical implementations of V2G in Australia or other countries? Are there any actual scenarios of EVs participation in electricity and ancillary markets? Thanks.
The ones that I'm aware of are mainly in Europe, and I gave a reference in the talk to a survey of those particular trials. They are just starting in Australia. One of the issues I think around this is it's not just technically how to make them work, but also how to extract the most value for all the stakeholders involved. But certainly there are trials that have finished and that are also currently underway, and the way in which value is provided to the grid and extracted for the owners of the vehicles, these are all developing. As I mentioned, the early trials were concentrating on global services, frequency control services. However, I think some of the more recent trials are also looking into local services such as voltage control, perhaps reactive power control.
Okay, thank you. I just had a question as well. If you look into, you talked about heavy electric vehicle and light electric vehicle. Is there any advantage in terms of V2G for large vehicles, I would say?
Yes, there's a couple of things there. First of all, the batteries are larger, and also they're often in fleet vehicles. So for example, buses, often not so utilised in the evening or during the night time. So you could have very large batteries sitting in the centre of the city in these depots, and the batteries in those buses could be participating in the local electricity system.
In terms of,
you get much more bang for your buck, I suppose. You need to aggregate fewer of them than you would need to aggregate of the light vehicles.
Hello, Dr. Town.
I can just hear someone.
Can you hear me?
Very faintly. Go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
That's better, thanks.
Okay, first, thank you for your informative presentation. It was really nice. And I have a question about aggregators. Since in the future, one of the concepts to control electric vehicle charging is using aggregators, I have a question about the type of aggregators. For example, for now, a lot of car companies are started to work to make chargers, so they can be a possible aggregator, or a lot of even oil companies like BP, or some of them are governmental companies. So what do you think the future of this aggregator would be? I mean, who is leading this industry? Are they car companies? Because it's really effective on the objective of them, each aggregator.
Yes, that's true. I'd say that at present it's very much up for grabs, and the industry, all parts of the industry, all stakeholders are trying to work out how best to move forward. To some extent, this depends on the regulations and the market, wherever these aggregators might be located. This has a significant impact on the value of aggregation, of course. In some places, aggregation may not even be allowed, at least currently. We hope that situation would change. So I think it's wide open in terms of opportunities and possibilities. The technology, you're limited really only by, I think, your imagination with what's possible there. With regard to things that are actually happening, I'd refer you back to the trials that I referenced in my presentation. In Australia, the main one that I'm aware of is, again, AGL. So AGL is a gentailer, I guess you'd call them. They are involved in both generation and retail side of the electricity market. And they are concentrating on providing energy management services essentially to domestic customers. And from several years ago, they've been quite proactive in providing these quite novel energy services, including demand management, including electric vehicle charging. And in fact, it was only a week or two ago that I heard that they had just started a vehicle-to-grid trial using consumer vehicles that are part of their, that are with AGL for their energy management products.
Okay, there is another question. Do you think battery swap stations can be a solution to some of the issues and challenges in grid support service you mentioned?
Sorry, could you repeat that one?
Do you think battery swap stations can be a solution to some of the issues and challenges in grid support services you mentioned?
Yes, again, there's a whole diversity of applications and needs, and they all have different solutions. One area that is particularly challenging is regional transport along highways. If everyone has electric vehicles and they all want to charge at a roadhouse somewhere along the highway, this is often at a point where the electricity infrastructure is not great. So one solution to that, and I know the CSIRO in Australia is working on this, is to have a large battery which you trickle charge essentially over time, and charge the vehicles quickly from the battery and charge the battery slowly at night time and at periods of low demand. So this again is the use of storage to smooth out the otherwise quite peaky demand, and it enables the provision of charging services where otherwise they might be impossible.
Mm-hmm. Another question in the chat room: is the Australian energy market ready for an uptake of EVs? Is there a place in the market where vehicles can sell their services?
Not currently. Really, the only opportunity at the moment is perhaps behind the grid, but behind the meter, sorry, with individuals buying a quite expensive bidirectional charger and managing their own energy requirements as a household. So where all this goes and the development of the market is quite unknown. I am aware that in Australia, at least, the market, there is a study underway, a review of the market, and it's difficult to know where it will go, except that in future it's likely to require people to be able to participate as prosumers. So again, households with photovoltaic on their roofs, electric vehicles in their garages, should be able to participate in the market. Whether this is a good thing or not, I'm a little bit skeptical, because again, as I mentioned, the stability of the electricity system has been compromised even now by market traders, and even with more responsive, faster responsive storage such as batteries, the delays in the network are going to make it very difficult to keep this system stable. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but it's an interesting area for research.
There is, I think, one last question, because I don't think we don't have time. How do you think about the EV charging strategies? For example, to reduce the peak demand, we need to control the aggregator EV charging to observe the PV generation. Centralized control, which dispatches the signal from one control center, is realistic to mitigate grid impact. What do you think?
Again, I think there's a whole range of possibilities out there which some people are starting to explore. And I don't think we should be constrained by the current grid in how we do things. For example, Ron Hui at City University in Hong Kong, I think, came up with this idea of electric springs, where you allow voltage around the network to vary, and you have electric springs, storage located around the network that responds to loads and supply locally. There's, as I mentioned before, electric vehicles are mobile, so we could even be transporting electrical energy around the grid the same way that we transport petrol currently around petrol stations. So this might be one way to supply regional areas, country towns, rather, if you know, until or instead of putting in solar farms nearby. Look, I think we're limited by our imagination in what's possible. The question is, what's going to be safe, acceptable, and what will spread the benefits, the costs and the benefits equitably amongst all the stakeholders. We don't want any part of the system benefiting more than is their due. And to be fair, you know, those who bear the risk should probably gain the most commercially out of this.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's, I think, conclude this session of the talk. Thank you very much for your talk. That was really interesting. And for the next talk, I would say you again need to disconnect and click on the link, which is available in the conference program booklet. Thank you very much and see you later.
Thank you very much, Professor Graham. Thank you. It was very great to have you, and it was an honor for us to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry you've got my bookshelf in the background.
No worries. It's all.
All right. I'll see you later.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.